am a lawyer, but I am not necessarily your lawyer. The materials discussed in this podcast are for informational purposes only and should not be deemed legal advice. If you have a specific legal question according to your circumstances, then I encourage you to speak with an attorney licensed in your jurisdiction. Hi, welcome back to another edition of Ag Law Today. And today we have Rusty Rumley in the house from the National Agriculture Law Center. Rusty, why don't you introduce yourself to our listeners? Tell us, where you are, what you do, etc.
Hey, Carrie. So I am a senior staff attorney here at the National Ag Law Center. My area, I cover a pretty broad swath. I do a lot of land use issues. And I do a lot of the public presentations for the center when we're actually able to travel around.
Excellent. So, Rusty, I don't think I ever asked you, what made you interested in agriculture law? Did you grow up in production agriculture?
I grew up on a cow-calf operation in western Oklahoma, and it was actually my livestock judging coach in high school that threw out the idea that I was pretty good with reasons, and he thought I ought to look into law. He knew a couple of other guys that had gone into ag law. So I decided fairly early on that was what I was going to focus on.
Yeah, I had a similar path. I didn't decide to go to law school till I was in undergrad. And I'm curious because I think for me growing up, I didn't know that many attorneys. I didn't really understand what they did. How about you growing up in Oklahoma?
I knew one. Our family attorney also had a fairly large cow-calf operation, and we had land next to him. So I did know that it was an option growing up.
All right, good deal. And how long have you been at the National Ag Law Center?
I've been in here in some fashion since 2008. So 12 years.
We're having fun. So today we're going to talk about the do's and don'ts of ag leasing. And Rusty, this is such a pet peeve of mine. Why do you think folks in agriculture are so resistant to getting leases in writing?
Because they've always done it that way, for one. And the second one is because they've always done it that way, they feel really guilty about asking the other party to get the lease in writing, because then it seems like they don't trust them.
Yeah, I know. And I hate that because I feel like part of the point of the lease is not about the fact that they don't trust the other person, but there's just things that could go wrong that people can't even foresee. Like perhaps there's a government taking or something like that. Would you agree?
Yeah. Usually the one that we see that's the most common is I'll go and I'll speak to a group of farmers, and one of them will stand up, and it's the basic story. I've rented this land off of Widow Johnson for the last 20 years, and she's got a heart of gold, and like everything works perfectly. We know what each other thinks. We don't have to write anything down. And then I usually have to ask, well, how old is Widow Johnson? And do you have that same relationship with her heirs? And usually it's, they don't know the kids, and it's like, well, those are going to be your landlords when Widow Johnson passes away one day. And maybe you'll have that same wonderful relationship with them, or maybe one of her kids is currently spending time in the state penitentiary. But you ought to look up who your people that you're going to be working with in the future is, and see if you can maintain that oral arrangement. And for a lot of them, they start to think about, well, maybe we ought to get this in writing before an abrupt segue, such as the passing away of a landlord.
So when folks decide, okay, I'm going to go ahead and put something in writing, and let's just take an example of a farm lease. What are some of the big issues that you think that farmers should make sure that they memorialize?
Most people put in there how and when they're going to get paid. I mean, that's usually something you don't have to worry too much about. One of my big pet peeves is that the very definition of a farm lease is that you are using that ground for a set period of time, sometimes for unset, but it's for a temporary period. Temporary might be 1 year, temporary might be 15 years. But at some point, that land is going to go back over to the landowner. So it's going to end. So you need to have something in the lease on how this lease is going to terminate. You know, we know it's not a permanent arrangement, so we need to face it on the front end that things can happen. The landlord might sell the property. The landlord might pass away, and you get new heirs or that take over. You might, as the tenant, you might find land available closer that you can purchase, and it'd be a better financial arrangement. There's reasons that are going to come up that you're going to want to end this lease, or the landlord's going to want to end this lease. So it's important that you have some kind of easily followed formula on how you terminate this arrangement.
Yeah, I think that that's a great point, because I think that a lot of people don't even think about that procedure until they need it. And if they don't have something memorialized that's clear, then I mean, sometimes in different states there are default laws that will come into play with oral leases on termination procedures. So past that, with an oral lease, there's not much guidance.
And some of those state laws aren't very good. I know, like here in Arkansas, our lease, or our lease law for terminating oral lease, you have to give written notice by certified mail on or before June 30th.
Oh my gosh! Wow.
They're basically assuming that your lease starts January 1st and ends December 31st.
Yeah.
But you don't have to start your lease on January 1st. I mean, your lease could be July 1 through June 30th. So if that was the case, you'd have to give 1 day's written notice in order to kick the farmer off the property. I mean, it's you want to avoid it, and the way to avoid it is get it in writing.
So what are some other issues that you think are pretty, hot right now? What about like hunting? Do you think that that's something that should be addressed in the farm lease?
I definitely think it's something that should be addressed in the farm lease, depending upon where you're at. In some parts of the country, a lot of times the hunting rights may actually be more valuable than the agricultural rights are. So it's a valuable commodity in some places. I know, like in eastern Arkansas, the farmers there can make more money leasing out their land for duck hunting to lawyers and doctors out of Memphis than they can actually harvesting and selling rice. Mm-hmm. So it's something that you need to be aware of. For some places, depending upon what you have available, what species you have available, and do you have any large population centers nearby, those hunting rights can be a really valuable asset to have. So
what special considerations would you give with farm leases for leases between family members? I mean, do you think that that's a situation where people are like, okay, yeah, I don't need a lease because it's with my family? Or do you think, yeah, absolutely, you should?
I think that's one of the best times to get a written lease. Sometimes we'll see them. You don't see the problem so much with like parents and children, but things like aunts and uncles and nieces and nephews. I mean, maybe they don't quite know them as well as they do their own children. I think it's important to have those kind of things written down. If you have a landlord and a tenant and they get into a fight, there may be some legal bills, but once that lease is terminated and the parties have paid off the damages and paid off the lawyers, everybody kind of goes their separate ways. If you got a family situation, it's really hard to cut the dinner table in half at Thanksgiving or Christmas. I mean, it makes the situation awkward. So for me, the written lease is even more important in those family situations, because you also want to preserve that relationship, and having things in writing so that everyone knows and understands what their responsibilities are. To me, it's even more important in the family situation than it is with complete and total strangers.
Yeah, absolutely. What terms with farm leases have you seen, Rusty? I know, sort of the default is with oral leases, you're looking at like a year-to-year situation. Yep. But written leases give, both the landlord and the tenant the opportunity for greater security. So what length of term do you think is the most common, and what sort of range have you seen?
A lot of times it's going to depend upon what area of the country you're in. What I've kind of noticed is different areas of the country have different traditions. Just like some areas will have much more oral leases, and other areas a written lease is a lot more common. Uh, Especially if you've got perennial crops. So alfalfa, down in Louisiana, sugarcane, those crops that are 4, 5, 6 years in length. Those people, a lot of them will go ahead and have written leases. People leasing things like orchards and vineyards and things like that. I mean, it's a very wise idea to have those in writing. Other than that, I mean, it kind of depends on where you're at. Oklahoma, there's a lot of Native American land, so a lot of those are 5-year leases. 5 years is fairly common for a lot of written leases. It kind of depends. Are you going to make capital improvements? If you're going to be sinking a water well for irrigation, you're going to want a much longer lease term so that you can recoup those sunk costs for drilling that well. So a lot of times it kind of depends on what the people are wanting to use the land for.
So with crop share leases, what are sort of the major terms that you would see there as far as the sharing of various expenses and managerial responsibilities, right?
Oh yeah. So a lot of that's going to depend upon the land lord themselves. Sometimes you'll have a landlord that is on the premises and they're able to provide some of the labor, or they've got equipment. You might see that with an older farming couple, and they've just decided to start renting things out, but maybe they're not quite ready to completely throw in the towel. So part of the arrangement will be, that farmer or the spouse will go out there and they're going to do some of the tilling, or they're going to do some of the spray application. Other times you'll have a landlord that's completely out of state and they'll have absolutely nothing to do with the farm. There's going to be no labor. Sometimes they won't even share expenses. So a lot of times it's really situation dependent. Looking at, are they available? Do they have the cash on hand to front some of those expenses? Some of the tenant farmers, it's a crop share lease. They're sharing part of the proceeds, but the more work that the landlord puts in, the more say they kind of have in what's going on. And a lot of farmers don't like other people telling them how to do their job. So, I mean, some farmers are kind of willing to say, hey, I'll, for a smaller percentage, I'll do all the labor, I'll pay for all the inputs, and you just look for that check a couple months after harvest time. So it's really, and that's one of the great things about getting a written lease is you can do all those kind of things and set out the scenario to fit what best fits the parties involved.
Right. I know it's more rare, but I actually ran into a cattle producer once who had a crop share lease in the cattle arena. And so I know that you don't really think about it in that way, but it's just really the sharing of input costs, profits, and also that managerial thing. And I think like who's doing what and who's making the decisions really needs to be properly memorialized. So along those same lines, Rusty, I don't know if you remember this, but many, many, many moons ago, I just started my law practice. And I think you wrote a piece about the different types of farm leases. And you even got into like active participation in farming, with Social Security implications. And I must have wrote a blog. I was inspired by the topic. I wrote a blog and I got a phone call from a producer in Kentucky who was wanting to retire, and he had some Social Security concerns and he didn't know what kind of farm lease that he should have because of that. So we went through the analysis. So I don't know, Rusty, do you want to touch on that topic a little bit?
For most people anymore, I usually tell them to work with their CPA on that one. Everyone's situation is so different. I mean, some people, it may not be enough income coming in to affect your Social Security. Others, it might be.
Mhm.
Payment limitation rules have changed since then. They actually just changed again here recently. So some of that actively engage. I mean, so some of that stuff can be. It's tricky. Like it's always fact specific on the specific farming operation. What are you doing? What services are you providing? Uh, that kind of stuff. You really have to. If you're worried about those kind of situations, that's something you want to sit down with that lawyer on the front end and say, hey, I'm retiring, I'm applying for Social Security. I want it to have the least impact that I can on it.
Mhm. Yeah,
I've
no, I think that's a great point.
I've known some farmers that they actually wanted to pay Social Security because maybe they hadn't vested over all these years. They had never vested because they hadn't been paying into it. And this was a chance that they could pay into Social Security and hit their. So I mean,
Yeah.
it really depends on who the person is and what they need.
No, that was exactly the concern with the farmer that called me because he didn't have enough Social Security credits. So, anyway, so let's talk a little bit about other kinds of leases. What about grazing leases? Do you see many of those in writing?
Actually, we're starting to see more of them. Some of your FSA programs, back a couple years ago, we had the drought assistance, disaster assistance for drought, and FSA wanted to see written leases. So we saw a lot of people doing written leases. I know I had to help some of my family members with written leases to prove that they had that land and they were farming that land at the time. A lot of those written leases were a half page in length. I mean, they were not really a very they weren't an adequate legal document, but because of some of those requirements, some of those documentation requirements, some of your banks are requiring written leases now. That kind of stuff. I mean, we're starting to see more and more of that stuff in writing, but I mean, a lot of times it's just the bare minimum. Length of the lease. This is the price. And that's just about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think I have my own family members that have similar, very simplistic, grazing leases, like an Excel spreadsheet, those kinds of things. And I guess from my position, I'd rather at least have something in writing. But I know that it certainly needs to be developed more. So why do you I guess we got to talk about why it is the way that it is, but how do you think that the culture could change in production agriculture to put more contracts in writing? I know that I've said this publicly before, but I feel like in no other industry are people doing as many deals with a handshake.
I think it is changing somewhat. I mean, so outside of this year, I do a lot of public presentations all around the country. Last year, I went from New York to Alaska. I covered pretty much every place in between. And every year, when I do the leasing presentations, I always ask how many people have oral leases, and the number of hands going up seems to be going down. I think it's one of those.
I would be so interested in that number. Like, I don't even want to say it because I know I'd be wrong, but
it's still
like
half the room.
Have oral leases, so maybe I'm wrong.
I think it's still about half of the room that admits to it. But when I first started asking 7 years ago or whatever, I mean, it was pretty much all the room that raised their hand. Mm-hmm. So I do think it's getting better. And usually it's kind of like talking to a farmer about estate planning. I mean, they know it's going to happen eventually. They just want to put it off. And if you talk to most of these farmers out there that still do oral leases, if you ask them, have you yourself or do you know of another farmer, have they gotten into a bad legal situation because of an oral lease? A lot of farmers can say, yeah, I experienced it, or I know someone else that had to hire a lawyer because of an oral lease. Mm-hmm. And everyone always thinks it's never going to happen to them, but I think it is slowly changing.
Mm-hmm. What other kind of leases are you seeing in agriculture that the farmers and ranchers are using?
I'm starting to see more of the hybrid leases, the flex leases. So they're basically a a cross between the cash lease and the crop share lease. And it kind of depends on who has the most power. Usually it's a little bit more in favor of the landlord, but this is a way that the landlord can, guarantee that in the bad years, you've got a base cash price that, you're at least going to make this amount of money. And if it's a good year and you have, good yields, prices are good, you may be able to get a kicker on top of it to take advantage of those good years. So we're starting to see some of those hybrid leases that take into account, profitability. The one thing with those leases are those formulas for determining rent are complicated. There's no way to do those orally. So that is one good thing for those landlords that are wanting to kind of have their cake and eat it too when it comes to the leasing situation of getting a fixed income and being able to capture higher rents in better years. They have to do it in writing. I mean, it's too complex to do it otherwise.
What about federal farm programs, especially in those kind of leases? Are you seeing those payments being addressed in those hybrid leases on how they would be allocated?
Yeah, you'll see things like that in the leases on how they'll be allocated. And the other thing is crop insurance. I mean, that's ever since that's really taken precedence after the 14 Farm Bill, we're starting to see a lot more language in leases giving them rights to crop insurance proceeds as well. So a good lease kind of takes that stuff into account.
So walk me through like the typical, or is there really like a typical procedure for negotiating a farm lease? Would you say that the majority of farm leases tend to be initiated by the landlord versus the tenant, or, is it evenly split?
I think it really depends on the situation. Sometimes it's fairly common. You have an older couple that's farming. Everyone knows they're wanting to get out. You'll start having neighbors approaching them like, well, if you want to sell it, I'd be willing to buy it. If you're wanting to lease it out, I'm really willing to lease it. A lot of times those kind of arrangements, it seems like, are worked out on the front end. So very rarely do you see a lot of things posted. I mean, a lot of this stuff is done by word of mouth or the ones that I typically hear about. I mean, you'll hear people grumbling like, "Wow, if I'd known that was available, I would have, put in a bid, or I would have liked a chance to lease it, but so and so got to them first."
Right.
So,
I mean, now that you say that, like I probably have never in my life have seen an advertisement, for somebody who's like looking for a tenant farmer. I mean, I just, everybody just magically has tenants, and
that's one of the reasons why it's been so difficult to get younger people into agriculture. Is, I mean, by the time they know that land has become available, someone else has already got it. I mean, it makes it difficult. I mean, people, they know their neighbors, and they know if, their neighbor had a heart attack and they might not be able to farm anymore, they'll, take them a cake and hope they feel better, and then kind of slip in that, hey, if you're done farming, if you're wanting someone to farm your land for you, please keep me in mind. I mean, I know I recently had my grandma passed away, and someone brought over flowers and mentioned, hey, if you wanted to lease out or sell her house, I'd like a first shot at it. I mean, you had people approaching. So I mean, you'll have those kind of situations, not always with people passing away, but other health concerns or people getting older, or so.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Have you seen very many leases dealing with farm equipment, Rusty?
Not a whole lot. The places where you will see those will be like your new and beginning farmers, and they're going to be leasing it off of an older farmer. And that farmers, they still got their equipment. They're no longer wanting to use it. So you might see a lease that incorporates them either renting the farm equipment along with the property, or like a lease purchase agreement on the equipment. Or sometimes you'll see it with farmers. The land is a lot farther away than the rest of the land they farm, and they don't want to deadhead tractors and equipment back and forth. So they might work out an agreement there. But
Mhm.
yeah, I don't tend to see very many of them.
Yeah. I know this isn't really a lease, but I'm also wondering about custom farming arrangements. Do you see those agreements in writing, or is it more of an oral situation?
I don't see a whole lot of them. I know they exist. They're one of those things. I think there's pockets of the country where they're very prevalent, and others they're not used at all. So, like where I grew up in Western Oklahoma, they were never used, and we don't tend to see a whole lot of them here in Arkansas, or at least this part of Arkansas. But parts of the country, they do a lot of the custom farming, and there are forms out there that are available. It's a good idea to get them in writing.
Yeah.
But it seems like every time I talk to a group, no one's really engaged in those. But I know they're out there.
What about wind energy leases? Of course, that could be its own like lease, right? But what about just sort of like wind energy and how that affects, perhaps a farming or a ranching lease?
Those are um, the wind is a little bit more complicated than the oil and gas. Oil and gas, it's usually the tenant really doesn't have a whole lot of say in the matter, and a lot of times the landowner, may not own the surface rights, so they don't have a lot of say in the issue. I mean, they both may be stuck with energy development on their property. With wind and solar, it's a little bit different because that's not tied to the mineral estate. That's tied to the surface rights. So that landlord, they're the ones also entering into that wind lease. So it's going to be important that they work with their farmer on what things are going to be done. Uh, for the wind turbines, I know once they're in there, they tend not to take up a lot of space. I mean, the pad itself is, you
Mhm.
know, 40 yards by 40 yards. And usually the thing that's the most disruptive to farming is the gravel road that leads from the turbine down to the road itself. They can be pretty disruptive when they're putting it in, though.
Okay.
So, but for most people, I mean, uh, usually it's been the oil and gas where we've seen the most problems with people uh, with leases. But it could just because they have more flexibility when it comes to the wind, because it's the landowner themselves that are entering into the lease.
So, where can our listeners find more information just in general about ag leases?
So we've got quite a bit of information on our website, on nationalaglawcenter.org. If you click on research by topic, we've got a whole reading room on leases. And a couple years ago, Tiffany Lashmet, Shannon Farrell, I think Paul Geringer helped, and we did a big leasing guide. And that's available up on our website. It's like 130 pages, but there's some farm leases in there. It's the Rancher's Agricultural Leasing Handbook. We do a lot of grazing and hunting stuff. There is some stuff in there for crop leases as well. But that's a pretty good comprehensive resource on things to look at.
And by the way, it's fantastic. I have a copy of it literally in my home study, and I've read through it. And it's a great resource for both lawyers and non-lawyers. And along those same lines, I mean, what would be your general suggestion to our listeners who feel the urge to just grab a form and just fill it out and use it?
I would say don't do it. The thing with written leases are great, but I've heard of people that have used form leases that they've grabbed off of the internet. And the thing with these form leases is judges like written leases. They're going to follow the written lease. So if you have two parties that never consulted a lawyer, the landlord could think that the lease says X. The tenant thinks the lease says Y, and the judge reads the lease and says, no, you're both wrong. The lease reads Z, and Z is what we're going to apply. So you may be getting into a lease with agreements that you don't know what they are. Your tenant doesn't know what they are, and you may find out at a much later date that it wasn't something that either one of you thought wanted to get into. So the thing with legal fees is it's usually a much cheaper to that old saying about an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. It's
Mhm.
usually easier to pay a couple $100 on the front end to get a lease form put together than it is to pay an attorney to litigate that on the back end. So
Yeah, I agree, Rusty. And I can't speak for all lawyers. I can only speak for myself. But I know that there are lawyers like me that if a client comes to me and says, I only have the budget for X, then I am going to try to do whatever I can to stay within that budget. Maybe all I can do is really review things and pull out a few red flags or say, okay, this is fine. I just want to make sure you understand X. It doesn't mean that, if you come to me with a pay less budget, you don't, I don't always need to give you a Rolls Royce. Like you know, I feel like legal services can fit into whatever budget that the farmer or rancher has.
usually for most attorneys, the more complex it is, the higher it costs. I mean, if you're wanting to split out hunting rights and you're wanting to do all these complicated payment mechanisms and take various security interests and all this other kind of stuff, it's going to be more expensive. Or if it's just more of a nuts and bolts, this is how you get out of it. This is how it's paid. If you have questions, this is how it's resolved. That stuff tends to you get what you pay for. So just don't get complicated, and it usually works out for most
Yeah,
people.
agreed. So, Rusty, where can people find you? What's your contact information?
The best way to reach me is by email. It's R Rumley, so RRUMLEY at uark.edu. So that's the best way to reach out to me. And our contact information is all on the National Ag Law Center's website.
All right, excellent. Well, thank you for coming to this podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me.